Okay, so I'm here today with Richard Kiser. He's the Economic Science Laboratory's Research Computing Specialist. Let me start off by asking you how you came to work at ESL. So how long have you been with ESL?
I started with ESL back in 1992 as an undergraduate programmer, just right out of high school. I was attending school at the U of A. They needed someone who could write code, and I had done some of that, so I started working with Sean Lemaster back then. He was basically the lab's director for development, computer development. So that's when I started with that, and from there, that was 24 years ago, I believe.
So in those early days at ESL, did you have the feeling that you were part of something that was going to be really big? That you were kind of part of the future of science in a sense, that what you were doing was going to really become very influential?
At the time, I did not. When I started, I basically was coming in with computer science background, just an undergraduate working with programming, had no real history with economics. So I had no clue that we were be in such a large field 20 years down the line. I've seen it grow over the years. We've done different things where we started with very local stuff, and seeing some of the interactions with neuroscience and now face reading, all of these different fields that economics has expanded into and incorporated in with the research. So I really did not know when we began that it would be this big.
Yeah, I guess technology has changed so much over the years. Let me ask you a bit about that. So, can you tell me what it was like, what the hardware in the lab was like when you started working there, compared to what it's like now?
It was very interesting. When I first started working in the lab, they actually had some of the old Novanet systems still around. Those were touchscreen interface systems that actually connected up to a mainframe back in Illinois. When I look at
that, must have been very modern at the time.
That was pretty modern, and actually it was kind of impressive because some of the experiments that they could do with that older technology, I think really took us several more years before we could kind of get to that stage on the PC platform. That's where my expertise were at the time. That's what I helped develop in. So we were, coding in C on old, PC, 2s. Several of them, were the big boxy type computers, and everything was kind of very archaic to where we are now. So I said there is more power. Actually, there's more power in my phone than there was with most of the equipment that we used at the beginning when I started in the lab 24 years ago.
How has the price of how's the price of hardware changed over the years?
The price of hardware has really dropped, and of course, you always pay a premium for the top of the line equipment, but the lab often was purchasing equipment from some lesser named companies to try and save money, because full-blown computer back then you're paying between $2,000 and $4,000. So we now buy all-in-ones computers for $600. So it really has changed drastically.
Can you tell me about how computer networking has changed over the years? So the transitions over the last 25 years.
When I first started the lab, we used an older protocol that was networking. It's called Token Ring. For the lab, it worked particularly well at the time. The problem with it is it didn't really grow. Ethernet took off, so we soon moved to Ethernet. And even with that, the protocols that were used 20 years ago have changed. So we used to use some old netware protocols that really limited us to running experiments only in our lab. So now we've grown, and we still have local network experiments that we've done, but as the internet has grown, we have more web-based programs now. Several of the we've gone through several iterations of kind of your code. Like I said, when I started, we were doing C, and then there's been a very large window of like Visual Basic programming was out there. I know when Kevin McCabe was at the lab, he taught classes and taught the grad students how to program in Visual Basic, and there are still some people out there who are using their Visual Basic experiments.
That was in the 1990s?
This was late 90s, late 90s is when that happened. So after the turn of the century, we had a little bit more. We've visualbasic.net, some more internet-based experiments. There's also the Z-Tree package that came out specifically for experimenters to develop software for the lab in there. A lot of this was Windows-based, so now that we've gone past just regular Windows, there was a period of time where things were developed in Java. Java was nice because, now we had internet-capable devices that allowed people to connect. So we actually had a few sessions where the instructor would run an experiment in the evening, and everyone was logging in on their computers at home. Then Java went through a bit of an issue with security, and a lot of people got to where they didn't trust it. So at the same time, HTML5, a more robust version of the language that runs web-based experiments, is developed. So we can do a lot of fancy things in web browsers now that we just couldn't do way back then. So we do have several web-based experiments now that really you wouldn't even think possible 15 years ago, 10 years ago even. So
has it become more reliable? I imagine it's become more reliable to run experiments in the sense that many sessions used to fail in the early days, that there would be a networking problem or some kind of hardware issue that would arise, and is that much less frequent now?
Failed experiments because of crashes is far less frequent now. And one caveat that I always tell people is, if they test their code before they come in. In the early days, C was not very forgiving when it came to mistakes. So the whole thing with everyone was freaked out about Y2K. Well, we were dealing with this similar issue with our variable scope long before Y2K came up because people would say, oh, well, I'm only ever going to run this experiment with 10 people. So all of their code was set for an array of size 10. Well, then they try to run it with 12, and unlike current languages where we get an out of bounds message so you knew what was going on, C was very interesting, and it would just actually overwrite something else in memory. So things would appear to be working, and then just later on, things would crash, and it would always seem random. We would joke that C was so particular that we would compile the code, and if there was an extra blank line, it didn't seem to work. But you take that line out, and things were working. So it was very particular back then. It's also the case it's gotten a lot easier for us to run the experiments. When we first started, we would have to have 20 minutes to set everything up. It was a lot of configuration at each computer to get things going. Now we basically click a couple buttons and it starts on all of the computers. And if we ever do have a crash or we realize, oh no, something's wrong, we forgot to change this, we can take everything down and restart it almost immediately. So the amount of failed experiments is decreased extremely in the past 15 years in particular, as we've also learned lessons from our original journey into software development. So
maybe you can tell us a bit about how was it like to work with such a distinguished group of researchers in those years, in the first few years you were here.
It was very interesting. I didn't know at the time that some of these people were going to be such large names. I really didn't truly know until later on that Vernon Smith was such a father of experimental economics, as it was called. So learning later that he would win the Nobel Prize and knowing that I worked for him was an extremely interesting situation for me, because I remember one time in particular we were all switching from our old DOS-based email system, and he was the last holdout in our Windows-based email system, and he says, "Oh, because I don't like it because I have to deal with that." And he pointed to the mouse, and he at the time did not want to have to learn how to switch. He felt that it affected his productivity. So, there was other things. I've dealt with people along the ways. Steve Ricenti was a terrific mentor as far as working with and developing experiments. I said I learned a lot from him as far as, okay, here's what the subjects are going to see and do, and this is how we wanted to design the user interface. Sean Lemaster was obviously a large influence for me, being basically the job that I have now is what he was doing when I started. So you had other people like Kevin McCabe, like I mentioned before, who taught a Visual Basic class. So learning from these people and learning from some of the mistakes that you had, like Kevin McCabe being an economics guy coming into trying to program, we ran into some interesting problems, and I can always tell when someone uses a piece of his code because there's one error that has just been perpetuated for like the last 20 years. I've pulled up a piece of code for somebody and I said, "You had Kevin's class, didn't you?" So because the error checking at the time, he did it in such a way that it was very particular to his style. So we've learned a lot from that. So it's been kind of fun, and other things where working with the neuroscience, and you don't think about it, but we had a computer that we basically just wrote off after it came to some of the neuroscience experiments, because the computer was sitting there close to the MRI, and the big magnet was not very happy. Did not do nice things to our hard drive. So it was, the computer was never used after that. So our current research is a lot more friendly to keeping our computer hardware going. But all of those guys, and Dave Porter, I think he still is kind of a clown. I remember, he said something to me once, and we were chasing each other around the lab, and I've always been, a big guy, and I think I shocked him one time because I actually jumped over one of the carols. So you just saw this big guy coming at him. So, but it's been a lot of fun over the years. So.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your experience, Richard.
Oh, well, thank you.